kind of want to start with talking a little bit about like the intention of this webinar. First of all, my name's Nate, and basically what we're wanting to do here is it's not a product pitch. It's not trying to sell you on something. It's really more of a different approach than I've seen historically in the marketplace with regard to information, right? It seems like a lot of information that farmers receive can unintentionally or intentionally become slightly biased. Part of the problem with that, a lot of times somebody has something to gain. So when you're told, what products to use or, how much to use, there's an aspect to that of, okay, well, is this purely based off of need or what's going to be best for my crop or for my business as far as ROI goes? Or is this being pushed towards me because, hey, this is what they have to sell or because this is what they make the most money on? And so the whole idea of this, entire series is to try to remove some of those aspects and really just focus on peer-to-peer science, more of a farmer-to-farmer talk, trying to keep things, complex enough to understand it, but simple enough to make it digestible. The cool thing is we have a very broad blend of people from different locations, different farming types, as far as corn and soybean operations or hay and pasture, or even cotton, peanuts, tobacco, you name it. And so, the approach is less so, hey, this is what you should do for this crop, but more so, this is how the science functions, right? This is how plants function, so that there's a lot better understanding of whether it be chemical inputs, nutrient inputs, or just general soil and plant processes. So that as you're making decisions that at the end of the day are going to impact your farm, are going to impact your bottom dollar and how much yield or profit that you're making, or both, that you have the right tools at your disposal to know how to make the right decisions and be educated in doing that. And so part of that process too, one thing to understand is as we kind of get in topic, this first topic was picked by, kind of sending out a general poll of like, hey, what do you want to hear about? And it kind of made me laugh when I saw it was the dry versus liquid, right? Because that's the age old back and forth banter of, which one's better. And so with that being said, it's kind of funny to start here. One, because it can seem kind of like a very general topic, but we're going to try to dive into some detail on it to, compare not just dry versus liquid, but nutrient forms in both dry and liquid, how those nutrients interact or react, whether it be with the plant, with the soil, with different weather types, and really start to understand that better. Because at the end of the day, the entire conversation about dry versus liquid is null and void because you're not taking into account all of the other variables, right? And so, it'd be kind of like an assimilation I've used in the past is it'd be kind of like saying, hey, what's better, my socket wrench or my hammer? Well, what are you doing, right? The socket wrench is great if you want to fix the tractor, but if you're mad at the tractor, you're probably going to grab the hammer. So, it's that kind of thing where it's like there are tools for different purposes, and understanding just like the tools in your toolbox that you use to fix a piece of equipment when it goes down, and you don't even have to think twice about which one you need. And if you've been doing it a while, you don't even have to think about, the socket size that you got to grab out of there because you can see that socket and know exactly what it is. It's the same mindset with regard to the tools that we use to feed a crop or to protect a crop, the tractors, the equipment, the different things that we use to farm, because these are the tools that drive our business at the end of the day. Going back to the topic at hand, the conversation then isn't which one is better. It's what tool do I use, when do I use it, and how do I use it most effectively? And if you understand those things, then it's not, hey, I use dry fertilizer. Hey, I use liquid fertilizer. It's I use dry fertilizer in this situation and in this form because of XYZ. I use liquid in this situation in this form because of XYZ. And I know a lot of you guys are probably sitting here going like, hey, I know this, right? We use, a mix of dry and liquid on the farm. And that's fantastic. And so, part of this is going to get into a little bit deeper on the science aspect. We'll also talk about some of the generalities, because the intention here is that out of all the people that, are either part of this today or, will be part of this series as it continues, we want to make sure, and I personally want to ensure that everybody involved has something that they're taking away. Because at the end of the day, the way I look at it is, the mindset, at least where I grew up and for a long time, was, it's me versus Joe next door, right? I got to outdo Joe. But that isn't the situation. The situation that we are dealing with right now as farmers is, it is us against our neighbor, but it isn't the neighbor next door to the farm. It's the neighbor next door in South America, or the neighbor next door in Asia, that we're now competing with. And if we don't start to open up the conversation and educate one another on how to be more effective at what we're doing, when we're doing it, why we're doing it, and what's working, then we're increasingly getting further and further behind. Because a lot of these countries are leaps and bounds ahead of us in their understanding and application of that understanding with regard to not just nutrient science, but soil science, manipulating different aspects of whether it be nutrient supplementation or nutrient availability within the soil, and making certain parts of that operation work either more efficiently or just completely turning around where things are working for them instead of against them. So instead of fighting your current soil condition to get what you need out of it, you're using tools, you're using these things to increase that soil's ability to work for you. And so with all that being said, I know one thing a lot of people know about me, and if you've ever talked to me on the phone, you probably know this. I can talk and talk and talk and talk. So I'm going to try to stay on topic as much as I can. One part about today is, I want this to be as much of an open conversation as possible. So at the end of this, we'll only have about 10 minutes this time. Once again, this is kind of a test run, but that last 10, 15 minutes of this webinar is going to be a Q&A, right? And I do have some generalized questions that were sent in prior to this, but I would really love to kind of hear back from the people that are here today and get their feedback with regard to, their specific questions for what we're talking about. And so with all that being said, and not getting too much more into the weeds, so to speak, let's get down to the root of it. Did you catch that? All right. And I think to understand fertilizer and the whole dry versus liquid debate, you kind of got to start at the beginning, right? And so Pocahontas took a fish. No, I'm just kidding. No, so, I mean, obviously, for a very long time, fertilizer was organic inputs, right? Whether that was manure or decomposing fish or whatever it may be, it was nutrient-rich organic matter forms that could be applied to the soil and would break down and supply nutrients. Over the years, we've had a lot of developments with regard to how we understand nutrient supplementation and the uptake of those nutrients to the plant. And then we've also had some great developments, starting with things like in the 20th century, the breakthrough of the Haber-Bosch method, which, is how we figured out how to take nitrogen and make it into a solid format so that we could use it as fertilizer. And then the development of that process. And we're going to also talk a little bit about during that history, how some of the influence has impacted our decision making, right? And so with that being said, Haber-Bosch method is kind of what kicked it off. And that was, like I said, developing a method and a process to create solid form nitrogen, right? And so that then kind of led into post-World War II. And the demand for fertilizer was starting to skyrocket, partially because of a push, right? So, we were making a lot of explosives during World War II, and those explosives were made out of things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, being that these are energy sources. And after World War II, the government had a whole bunch of material that they didn't know what to do with. And so what ended up happening is, long story short, an approach was developed of, hey, all of these inputs, all of these plants that we've built can be used to supply farmers with fertilizer to increase the output on their crop. And thus began, the fertilizer boom. And out of that, you had agencies in the 1960s like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the land-grant universities that were pushing a higher analysis granular fertilizer. They were concentrating on developing, better methods of application for DAP, which is, 1846O, and MAP, 1152O, and that could deliver more nutrients per pound that was applied to the soil. And so for farmers, this was a game changer, right? Farmers could spread a few hundred pounds of granules per acre and give crops a huge nutrient boost. And by the late 60s and 70s, granular NP and K fertilizer like urea, DAP, potash had become the standard. And as we all know, since then, that process, has refined somewhat, but it hasn't exponentially changed, right? Our process with which we supplement the soil and we feed crops has been pretty steady over the years. And part of the reason, dry worked well wasn't just for the farmer, right? It worked really well for the distributors because the storage and the blendability of dry NP and K was much easier than trying to figure out how to store or blend liquid forms. And the ability to manufacture different liquid forms was still really in its, infancy. And so, there was quite a bit of influence with regard to the form that we use fertilizer just because of the tools that we had at hand. Back then, every farm didn't have a sprayer like it does nowadays. That wasn't just, a common farm tool like it is now. And you got to realize, things like glyphosate being developed around the same time. And it was, years before that was really heavily used on farms. And so sprayers weren't an item that farmers carried. So whereas a spreader, well, hey, I can take a manure spreader because I've been spreading manure and I can use that to spread these pellets out. And so it was a natural process for taking on dry. And once again, the argument isn't, hey, dry is now null and void because of the changes we've seen. It's now, okay, we've got more tools that have been added to the bucket, so let's understand those better. And so let's talk about liquid fertilizer a little bit. So liquid forms of fertilizer have been around for decades too. This isn't, a brand new thing. Everybody knows that. But the difference that a lot of people don't understand is there was a slower adoption and then also a lack of understanding with regard to the form of nutrient or how a liquid fertilizer was being made, right? So the early impression of liquid fertilizer wasn't very strong because a lot of it came down to, hey, we're just going to take dry forms, and I'm talking about mostly DAP, MAP, potash. We're going to take dry forms and we're just going to dissolve those in liquid. And that process didn't prove to be very efficient because you ended up with, a lot of issues with sprayers, things clogging up, and you name it. And so it didn't have a massive positive impact, and it just created more hassle, more work, more overhead, and more cost, and it didn't make a lot of sense. Now, what did make a lot of sense was anhydrous ammonia, which, is the form with which we get nitrogen out of the Haber-Bosch, which is an 82-0-0, right? 82% nitrogen. Now, the issue with that is it's a liquid under pressure, right? And as you know, if you've ever dealt with anhydrous, it's not exactly the easiest thing to deal with either. But the beauty of it is it became a very popular form of nitrogen in the mid-20th century because of the amount of available nitrogen that you could apply at a time to a crop. And so that progression, kind of, or that implementation of anhydrous kind of opened the door to further insight into, hey, let's look at liquids in different forms and how we can supplement plants better. Because one thing we all know about plants is plants don't consume dry matter, right? They absorb, they use osmosis to take in their nutrients. So when you're looking at, and we'll get more into this later, but when you're looking at dry versus liquid, well, both of them have to get into a chemical form and a physical state, okay, not a solid, in order, well, I say not a solid, they have to be in a liquid state in order to be absorbed by the plant. So there's other aspects of play. Regardless of these developments, regardless of UAM becoming a really solid solution, the debate of, dry versus liquid lasts to this day. And so with that, kind of backdrop, dry fertilizer has been the traditional workhorse for building up soils, while liquid approaches have introduced new flexibility and precision into these processes. And so what I want to do is dive into what happens after you apply a fertilizer, both in dry form and liquid, because to really compare what works, why it works that way, and how well it works for you, we need to understand the journey those nutrients take from the bag or from the tank to the plant root and then into the cell and so on. Later conversation about how it works within the plant, but mostly right now we're looking at getting things into the plant. And so, with all of, that kind of intro out of the way, let's dive into a little bit of the soil science of what actually happens after application. So after you've applied fertilizer, let's just say maybe you broadcast 200 pounds of a dry blend, and maybe you sprayed some liquid as well. So what happens at that point? This is where things get a little interesting and where a lot of myths start to originate from. So don't worry, I'm going to try to keep this as relatable, but also in depth as possible as we kind of talk through that soil process. So the first thing to consider with a dry granule sitting on the soil surface, in a perfect world, rainfall or soil moisture will dissolve that granule. It breaks apart, and nutrients now in an ionic form enter the soil water solution. A liquid fertilizer, by contrast, starts out already dissolved, already in that ionic form. You spray it on or inject it in, and it's immediately dispersing into the soil water. And in either case, the nutrients you applied join the complex soil environment, right? So the key point is that they don't just sit there in a pure form waiting for roots to suck them up. Right? The soil itself starts to interact with those nutrients right away. And to kind of take a step back, and this is something we'll get into in another time, talking about soil mineralization more in depth, is, a lot of people think, oh, well, these nutrients that are in my soil, if I apply these nutrients to it and look at a soil test, those are the exact nutrients, right? That is one of those myths of not understanding things like phosphorus cycling or soil mineralization and the impact that has. So one of those things that we want to talk a little bit about today is CEC. So soil is what we call an inert medium, right? It's an active chemical and biological system, right? It is not just a cup, like the analogy I like to use, that you put stuff in, because there's a lot of things at play with regard to how those nutrients are either being held, how they're being stored, how long they're able to be stored, etc. So many of you know about cation exchange capacity. You've probably seen it on a soil sample at some point, or just CEC. That's basically a measure of how many positively charged nutrients the soil can hold. With that being said, I like to explain CEC with, believe it or not, a cup analogy, right? Now, imagine your soil is like a series of cups or buckets, buckets if you got great soil, that hold nutrients, right? A clay or organic matter rich soil is a bigger cup, right? A higher CEC. It can hold a lot of nutrients, right? And so those nutrients are going to be primarily, hence cation exchange capacity, your cations. So those are things like calcium, magnesium, potassium, ammonium, right? And so a sandy soil, by contrast, is like a smaller cup, right? It can't hold as many nutrients before they leach out or they're lost. And so those nutrients and that holding cup's existence, because of clay and humus particles, those particles carry negative charges. So they're binding to those things. Those are holding them in an available state, right? Acting like magnets, kind of, that are positively that your positively charged nutrients can bind to, right? And so when you apply, say, potassium in fertilizer, much of it will stick to those exchange sites. On clay and humus, rather than roam freely around the soil, right? And so that's good. That's what we want. It keeps potassium in the root zone rather than it just immediately wash away. But it also means not all potassium is immediately available in soil, right? And it's going to have impacts on other things too, like nitrogen, right? So lower CEC means if you're applying a lot more nitrogen at any given point in time and your holding capacity, or potassium, right, and your holding capacity is lower, kind of goes without saying, that cup's overflowing, right? You're not able to fit it all in the cup. So there's a huge lack of efficiency. And there could be an entire hour-long conversation about CEC, how to interpret it, how to make it work for you. Because if you need to understand the impact your CEC has on the nutrients, right? So we're kind of starting a little bit cart before the horse with regard to specifically talk about the nutrients. So eventually we'll cycle back and talk more about it. But what I want to talk about is what nutrients are negatively charged, right? So those are your anions. And so things like sulfate, nitrate, they're not held by CEC, right? They're going to be, in fact, the cups repel them, so to speak, being like charges. They're the opposite. So these anions remain in the soil solution and can move freely with water. If you get sandier soil or a lower CEC, you can apply a lot of nitrate or sulfate. And those nutrients are going to be a lot more prone to leaching. Like water running through a small cup with holes in the bottom, it's going to run right through, right? So timing and amount become critical to avoid unneeded loss. And so now let's talk about phosphorus. Since phosphorus is often at the heart of the dry or liquid debate, when you apply phosphorus fertilizer, whether it's MAP, DAP, or liquid like 1034O or 318, the phosphate ions don't travel very far in the soil. So that's one thing you need to understand about nutrients is you have semi-mobile, highly mobile, and immobile nutrients, right? And that means it's moving around a lot, right? And so phosphorus, kind of lazy. It likes to kick back, relax. And so what that means is there's not a lot of movement throughout, the soil. So the long and short, then, your plant has to work to get to that. The MSU extension has noted that less mobile nutrients like phosphorus can get closer. The closer they can get to the root zone, the more effective they are at uptake by the plant and impacting the crop. Whereas in a liquid form, nutrients are initially more dispersed in soil and water, and dry, it's a lot more condensed. Point then becomes the placement of those to make sure that they're getting close to the plant. So a liquid band can create a plume of availability in phosphorus in the soil solution that roots can find, whereas a granular clump or a broad distribution might be, less so accessible if you don't have a broad root system by the plant. And so another thing happening after application is chemical reactions and tie-up, right? Soil minerals and microbes start interacting with your fertilizer nutrients immediately. For example, phosphorus quickly reacts with elements in the soil. In a high pH or an alkaline soil, phosphate loves to grab onto calcium and form insoluble calcium phosphate compounds. In a low pH or an acidic soil, phosphate gets snagged up by iron and aluminum oxides. And in either extreme, a lot of the phosphorus you applied becomes fixed or tied up, right? If you've ever heard that term, in forms the plant can't access. This is why often, only 10 to 30% of phosphorus fertilizers you apply is actually taken up by the crop, which when you think about that, kind of shocking, a little bit sad, but it is true. And it's because, just the form that's in, or not form, that wouldn't be the right way to put it, but the chemical compound and structure and reaction of that phosphorus in the soil. And so with your normal, rest in the soil, there's what we call the soil reserve, which is, your compounds that are locked up or lost in the ground. Similarly, only about 35 to 60% of potassium and about 50 to 75% of nitrogen from fertilizer is used by the crop in 1 year. The efficiency is surprisingly low. And that starts kind of the conversation between the liquid and dry as far as efficiency, right? The unused nutrients aren't necessarily gone, like phosphorus, potassium. They tend to stay in the soil. Many are still there for, future crops, which is why soil tests can rise over time. You kind of build up soil banks. So let's illustrate phosphorus tie-up visually. Let's take a look at, how those things are impacted. So to kind of visualize, how phosphorus is available and compared to your other nutrients, what you want to think about, once again, comes back to the mobility factor. If your higher mobility nutrients like nitrogen are going to be easier to move through the soil and get to where they need to be to get to the plant, and your lower mobile nutrients obviously, like phosphorus, are going to be more difficult. So what about the nitrogen in the soil, to kind of stick back on that for a second? When you apply urea, in a dry format, we're talking here, 4600, soil enzymes and water will convert it to ammonia, right? By producing ammonia, first, this process temporarily makes the soil around the urea particle alkaline, right? It gives it a high pH, and that can produce free ammonia gas, right? If that urea is sitting on the surface on a warm day, as most of you already know, some of the ammonia gas is going to escape into the air, right? That's what we call volatilization. Essentially, your nitrogen fertilizer is evaporating because nitrogen wants to be a gas. It doesn't want to be in a solid state. So incorporating your urea greatly increases, the ability for it to work, or applying it, heavy rain, like we're often told, especially for, hay operations where you don't want to be tilling in your urea probably. It's going to increase that efficiency, right? And so the other aspect that a lot of people don't know or talk about very much is how soil bacteria impact that process, right? So that conversion of, ammonia to nitrate requires soil microbes, right? And I'm not talking about, hey, you don't need, nitrogen if you got the microbes. I'm talking about you need the microbes for the nitrogen, especially urea, right, that you're applying to be able to get to the plant in the right state. So there's things that are going to impact your availability or your use rate of a nutrient that has to undergo microbial conversion before it's absorbed, right? So that's where the whole conversation of understanding soil health and its impact on the nutrients that you're using outside of CEC, and talking more about things like pH of the soil, talking about microbial life in the soil, has a huge impact on the efficiency of that fertilizer, right? A term you'll hear me use a lot is miles per gallon, right? We all have a pretty good understanding of miles per gallon. So it's a great way to assimilate, just because you've got a gallon of gasoline or 10 gallons of gasoline doesn't mean you can go X amount of miles, right? The engine that is carrying that vehicle and the miles per gallon it gets is going to determine how far you go. And there are ways, whether it be through the type of nutrient that you're applying, when you're applying it, how you're incorporating it, or if it's before rainstorm, or the health of your soil, are going to impact that miles per gallon, right? That efficiency that you get out of it. So right now you might be thinking, okay, Nate, plants ultimately take up the same basic ions no matter what. Nitrate is nitrate, phosphate is phosphate. So why would it matter, now as we get into this, between liquid or dry? And that's a very fair question. Chemically, the plant's roots can't distinguish the source that it came from. It can't distinguish the tractor that spread it out or the sprayer. A phosphate ion looks the same to a corn root, whether it came from MAP, DAP, or 1034O or 31818, right? However, what does matter is the context, right? How close those nutrients are to the root, when they're available, right? That's your timing, and what else they're accompanied by in the soil solution, like salts, right? And you probably hear about low salt or high salt fertilizer. We'll talk a little bit about that. And so the form, whether it be dry versus liquid, influences those contextual factors. A granular fertilizer sits in one spot and dissolves gradually, potentially creating a high concentration, right? Or what we call a hot spot in the soil. A liquid, especially if banded or evenly sprayed, can spread nutrients more uniformly in the soil moisture. So liquids can also be applied in season or full year for quick uptake, whereas granular is mostly soil applied, right? Because once again, that liquid is going to be able to go straight in the plant. So if we're trying to get something on in season, or we have a lack of moisture, let's say, right? It's late in the season, it's dry like we've had in some past years, and we know that demand for potassium is the highest during pod fill or grain fill. And we need that potassium in the plant, but the moisture is not there in the soil, then that's one of the ways we use those tools, right? That's one of the ways we use that tools in a belt to say, okay, well, I need a form of potassium the plant can take up without needing so much reliance on pre-existing soil moisture. So to sum up, this kind of section, after application, nutrients enter a complex dance, right, with the soil. Only a fraction is immediately available to the crop. The rest becomes part of the soil's nutrient bank or is lost. Our job as managers of a farm and managers of crop is to get as much of what we apply into the plant as possible when the plant needs it and minimize what gets tied up or lost, right? That's being the most efficient with your tools, with your inputs to increase your ROI. Whether you use dry or liquid can influence that outcome by affecting distribution and reactions. And one side note before we move on to the next section, we're going to mostly be talking about macronutrient state, but there is a large impact as well, going back to the vehicle analogy of catalysts, right? So your macronutrient, especially nitrogen, right? It's fuel. It's a fuel for the plant that the plant is using to divide cells and to grow. And so depending on certain catalysts, things like boron, those are going to impact how much fuel it takes to achieve the same process, right? That miles per gallon, am I getting 10 miles per gallon or 20 or 30, right? Is the same unit of nitrogen producing twice as many cells because it has a catalyst? Or am I having to use twice as much nitrogen to do the same thing because I don't have that catalyst in there? And so now I want to kind of jump into a nutrient by nutrient comparison. Every nutrient we manage, in particular, your nitrogen, your phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, your micronutrients, has its own quirks and how it behaves in the soil and how plants take it up. And one analogy I used recently was, if you think of the soil and nutrients in the soil like a teeter-totter, right? And the problem is then the teeter-totter has 16 people on it, right? And every time one thing goes up or down, it's going to affect the balance of everything else. And so the dance, to go back to that analogy that we're trying to achieve, is how do you get that perfect, right? Nobody ever does. There's too many things at play. This is not a perfect world. We're not working in a laboratory, but the more we understand about how that dance, how that balance affects one another, we can get a lot closer to it, right? So to dive in a little bit on nitrogen first, right? Nitrogen is typically supplied, mainly as ammonium, nitrate, or urea, right? That's UAN. So with that being said, dry in fertilizers typically are primarily urea with ammonium sulfate and ammonium nitrate as well. And then your various NPK blends, are going to primarily consist of urea. Your liquid N is going to come mostly as a UAN, right? And that's urea ammonium nitrate. So we're getting a little bit of each in a liquid solution, right? And so that's where it's funny when you hear the dry versus liquid debate is, the UAN contains all three of those elements and has urea in it. It's just in a liquid form. And so with that being said, as a dry versus liquid consideration, with dry nitrogen, the common practice is broadcasting urea or spreading it as dry fertilizer blends before planting or top dressing during the season. With liquid N, you have an option like banning UAN beside the row, injecting it, or even spraying UAN mixed with herbicide across the crop, right? One big advantage of liquid is precision and timing, right? Whether that be liquid nitrogen or liquid in general, it does offer those two aspects. You can easily split applications. For example, some farmers will apply part of their nitrogen at planting in dry format and then come back and side dress, like on corn, with a liquid, right? Very common practice. And it, once again, is addressing those, efficiency and timing factors. This aligns nitrogen supply with crop uptake stages, reduces the risk of early season losses, and you can split apply with dry in, like with hay and pasture, where you're going between each cutting. So, what about losses, right? If you broadcast dry urea on the surface, you need a rain or you need to incorporate it to prevent volatilization, right? So that's one of the factors you have to take into consideration when we get into the ROI. So liquid UAN has the same issues for the soil and for the process as urea does. UAN is 50% urea, right? 25% ammonia, 25% nitrate. So about half of what you spray as UAN is urea that could volatilize if left on the surface on a hot day, right? That's where you see crops burning. That's what's happening there. However, many liquid applications will dribble UAN in bands or inject it slightly into the soil, which that really helps reduce the loss, and hydrous ammonia, though we're mostly, focusing on non-anhydrous today, is injected directly in, right? And it immediately reacts to become ammonium in the soil. It's very efficient if done correctly, but it requires specialized equipment and safety considerations because, like I said, if you've ever worked with it or seen a shrunken dollar bill, you know that stuff is a little bit more complex. But to kind of, encapsulate, this conversation between liquid versus dry UAN, they are both great tools. It comes down to understanding the efficiency, right? You're going to get a higher efficiency out of a liquid, especially because of foliar feed aspects or immediate uptake by the plant. You're going to get a little more stability out of a dry, typically. And then, combining those with cost factor, right? And so then that allows you to go, okay, based off of this year, the weather, the crop, whatever it may be, the soil type I'm dealing with, right? If I'm dealing with the sandier soil, am I wanting to rely heavily on the soil to supply or to hold the nitrogen for the plant? Am I wanting to space that out into multiple applications or bypass that to some degree with a foliar feed of nitrogen, right? So the bottom line, both dry and liquid can get the job done for supplying nitrogen. Dry might be cheaper per pound of N, but liquid offers more precise placement and timing, right? Many farmers actually use an ammonium nitrate in a timely fashion, right? So liquids can help ensure it's there when needed through split application, right? That's where the spoon feeding really becomes a lot more efficient mechanism to increase ROI because you're not dealing with as much loss. But if you have the management capability, you can achieve similar results, right? With dry in a split application. It just might take a little bit more effort, right? So, moving away from dry and into phosphorus. Phosphorus is really kind of a fun one because phosphorus is a little more picky than nitrogen is. Obviously, we kind of talked already about its lack of mobility. So the main inorganic phosphorus fertilizers are orthophosphates and polyphosphates. And this is where, I have a lot of people go, hey, I've heard this, ortho versus poly, or hey, I focus on ortho rather than poly. So we want to talk a little bit about what that means. So granular phosphate fertilizers like MAP and DAP consist of mostly polyphosphate orthophosphate blend, right? Whereas the easily water soluble aspect is going to be your orthophosphate, right? That's the more readily available to the plant. Liquid phosphate fertilizers like 1034O are going to also be kind of a mix. And then when you get into things like 31818, 624-6, 102010, these different starters, those are typically going to be primarily ortho or 100% ortho. So when you hear somebody say, is this 100% orthophosphate, what really you're asking is this 100% available to the plant immediately, or does it need a conversion, right? And so why I say that is because for plant uptake, orthophosphate is the form that plants actually absorb, whereas a polyphosphate must first convert to an ortho in the soil. So we have a little bit longer delay. We have a little bit more, availability for things to go wrong and to lose, product, or if you don't have really good, microbial population in the soil or the conditions are poor, you're going to not get as much available phosphorus to the plant. And that's part of the reason why that phosphorus number was so low compared to everything else as far as how much actually gets used by the plant. So phosphorus is a nutrient where when placed correctly, can have a huge impact, especially because as we all know, it's one of those that just keeps going up and up and up in price every year. And what we don't realize is a lot of what we're paying for is inefficiency, right? So, for instance, using a orthophosphate, say 1034 or 3H and 18 in furrow or right by the row, puts a pool of phosphorus right with the seed, right where that root's going to be able to get it easily. And so with dry fertilizer, you can practically put it with this, you cannot practically put it with the seed because it would become too corrosive. It hurt germination. And so the dry alternative is the 2x2 band, right? Which a lot of us use. And that puts it right next to the seed, still keeps it available. But broadcasting phosphorus on the surface means you're counting on rain to wash it in. And not just wash it into the soil, but wash it into the root zone, right? So you got a 30-inch crop now, unless you got roots that are coming all the way into the middle, a lot of that phosphorus, right, isn't getting used. You're relying on, soil microbes to convert it, and then the root to actually contact it to take it in. So one of the most often cited benefits of liquid phosphorus starter is improved availability in cold soils. So in the early spring, soils are cold and biological activity is going to be a lot lower. And what that means, and that's where the phosphorus cycling comes in, right? And we can have a whole conversation about that one day. Meaning, that if you apply a polyphosphate, it might convert to orthophosphate a lot slower, potentially limiting what's immediately available to the seedling. So if you're planting in colder soils and you're wanting, to get fertilizer on before planting, you got to take into account, what is that soil temperature and how is that impacting the phosphorus conversion of the form that I'm using, especially if I'm using a dry form. And so, that is one of those things where when you look at that, for example, there's a figure often mentioned, and it's originally attributed to a long-term study done by Michigan State. Basically, it was tracking to see efficiency of especially phosphorus, poly versus ortho, et cetera, liquid versus dry, right? Here we go. We're getting really into it. So the liquid phosphorus fertilizers showed over the course of years during this study to have up to 4.5 times more efficient in getting into the plant, right? 4.5 times more of that phosphorus that you applied was actually available to the plant compared to the same amount of phosphorus in a dry fertilizer. How's that possible? Well, they found that only about 20% of phosphorus from granular fertilizer actually got into the plant, whereas about 90 to 95% of the phosphorus from a foliar applied liquid made it into the plant, right? And so now to be, transparent, that 95% figure was a foliar feeding figure, right? So while the 20% was broadcast granular phosphorus getting into the plant in 1 year, but it illustrates a real point, right? That point being efficiency of uptake. If you broadcast 100 pounds of phosphate in a dry form on the soil, perhaps, about 20 pounds of that is actually going to get absorbed by the crop that season. Whereas if you apply the same 100 pounds in a well-placed liquid, you've got way too much phosphorus now, because 4 to 5 times more of that than the dry is going to get in, which means you're getting anywhere from 80 to 100 pounds of phosphate into the plant, which is more often than not more than you need. So that's why the conversation comes in a lot of times like, why isn't a 1-to-1? Why isn't it a 1-to-1? If I'm using X amount of pounds of MAP or DAP, why wouldn't I just use the exact same amount with liquid, right? I get that question a lot, and that is a great question. It comes down to that miles per gallon, right? That efficiency of what is getting into the plant out of what I apply. And that's why with, liquid phosphorus, whether it is used in furrow, whether it's banded right on the row, so it's on that root system, or whether it's foliar applied, or all of these, we're increasing efficiency to decrease synthetic need and input, which is going to help to decrease, operating costs, input costs, to help drive ROI in the right direction. So that's one of those ways where we can start to manipulate, especially, when market price of phosphorus starts getting really high, like it is now, or like it has, in 2022, when it's over $1,000 a ton. You can start going, hey, I might be spending more per nutrient for a liquid, right? But when you account for the 4.5 times efficiency, now I'm spending less per nutrient used. And so that's where it becomes important to understand the efficiency of, these nutrients. And so with that being said, the rate of phosphorus is adequate. Let's say it's adequate, right? And crops often don't show a yield difference, whether phosphorus came from poly or ortho, liquid or dry, right? It comes from how much of that phosphorus it could get, right? And so, if you look at a Nebraska study that was comparing corn yields using polyphosphate versus orthophosphate, there's sources of equal phosphorus and potassium rates and found no difference in yield, right? It's 124 bushel to the acre. Not great, but for both sources at a low phosphorus rate, the 142 bushel per acre for both was higher. The difference there being, once again, you're having to take into account the amount that actually got in the plant versus the amount that was lost. So if you say in a study like that, if you go, okay, well, we know based off of all this data we have over the years of the, how much phosphorus we have to apply in MAP or DAP. So we're going to apply the same amount in a liquid format in order to, get this a similar trial, right? Here's what happens there is now in the liquid format, you have an excess amount, which, can have negative repercussions, in certain circumstances, but more often than not just means you're spending more than you need to on that, liquid form versus the dry, because you're trying to compensate for the lack of efficiency in the dry, right? And so the next factor that, then you have to start to look at is salt and the pH differences. Remember, DAP and MAP have different effects in soil. DAP, when it dissolves, creates an alkaline zone, right? pH can spike above 7.5 around that granule because the ammonium in DAP picks up hydrogen in the soil and leaves behind hydroxide. The higher pH can actually reduce phosphorus availability in that spot. And it's kind of working against itself, right? And so by causing more fixation with calcium, if the soil has, high calcium parts per million or base saturation, it can release some ammonia that could harm seedlings if placed too close, right? Same with MAP. MAP is acidic. It releases a bit of acidity, which can increase phosphorus solubility immediately around the granule. But one reason MAP is often preferred is because of that factor, because in a 2x2 or close to the in furrow or into the, close to the seed, it's going to be a little bit gentler, so to speak. Liquid polyphosphate like 1034 are usually near neutral pH, right, in the solution. But once in the soil, as they convert to an orthophosphate, they'll be subject to the same tie-up issue, right? Which is why 1034 and things like 3-HNT or 624-6, even though it's two different forms of liquid, right, two totally different effects, right? And how you use it, when you use it, why you use it, right? So that, is case in point of there isn't a liquid or dry is better. It's what form, right? And so bottom line for phosphorus, if your goal is to maximize immediate uptake and early growth, liquids, in particular orthophosphate heavy liquids or 100% ortho liquids applied near the root, right, can be very effective. If your intention is, hey, I didn't even put on any DAP or MAP this year because of the cost, well, that's when you start going, okay, well, if I start having phosphorus issues, this is when I want to start either banning it on or fully applying it like that Michigan State study, so I'm getting a really high efficiency, but I'm not having to use a whole bunch, right? It's going to keep your input costs down because of that increase of efficiency. And so let's jump into one of my favorite nutrients for no particular reason, but potassium, right? The most common potassium is potash, right? Which is potassium chloride, 0060 or 0062, depending on the grade that you're getting, right? It's dry, it's granular, right? Other than dry potassium sources, other than those dry potassium sources, you have potassium sulfate, which is potassium and sulfur, right? You have a liquid form of that as well, which is KTS, potassium thiosulfate. You have KMag, which is potassium and magnesium and sulfur. So there's a lot of different ways you can get potassium. And that's one of the reasons why, whether it is liquid or dry, you want to understand the form it's coming in and the things that are coming along with it. Because usually it's not showing up to the party all alone. Look at that. What's this? Potassium nitrate, right? There's another one. There's a lot of different forms, chemical compounds that you can get here. I'll just show you what these little beads look like, right? It's challenging to get a really high potassium analysis in liquids because many potassium salts either have low solubility, it's very heavy as well, or they make a very salty solution. For instance, if you tried to make a liquid out of potassium chloride, you'd hit a saturation point and likely salt out crystals in cold water. The second you mix that in the tank, you're plugging everything up. And that's why starter liquids that contain potassium, like 3-HNT, 9-89, 10-20-10, often use potassium phosphate, right? Or similar compounds instead of potassium chloride. And then a lot of times they'll use potassium hydroxide, or now you'll even find potassium carbonate and bicarbonate as well, which are, a little bit easier to use, a little bit higher analysis. So often, with potassium phosphate or similar compounds, it's worth noting that, in this section, we're going to kind of compare and generalize a little bit with like things like 3H and 18 because it's a good benchmark, right? So in those, the potassium in that 3H18 is derived from something called monopotassium phosphate or potassium polyphosphate, which have a lower salt index, right? So the dry versus liquid consideration here, potassium is moderately mobile, right? It's not super lazy, not super energetic, likes to get around, but not too much, kind of like me. It's not as leachable as nitrate. But in very sandy soils with lower CEC, potassium can leach beyond the root zone. Or if there's heavy rainfall or irrigation in heavier soils or in lighter soils, that can cause it to leach as well. In heavier soils, potassium mostly moves by what we call diffusion, and it gets held on CEC receptor sites, right? If you broadcast potash on the soil surface, it will dissolve with rain or moisture, irrigation, whatever, and will generally move downward with water until it gets taken up or held by those clay particles. And so in a no-till system, repeated surface applications can lead to some potassium stratification, right? That's where lots of potassium is on the top few inches and there's less below. And that's one of the things about, soil test is, soil test is going to tell you how much is in the first 6 inches or the first 8 inches, but it's not going to tell you where it's at in those 6 or 8. And you might not think that that's actually a factor, but it is. And so in a no-till system, repeatedly applying less mobile nutrients to the surface, like phosphorus or like potassium, which is semi-mobile, you end up at the risk of getting a higher concentration higher up, which means your roots are going to want to grow closer to the surface, which means you're going to be more susceptible to drought because your roots aren't reaching downward, right? So these are, some of those considerations when you look at, dry versus liquid is, hey, where is it getting to in my ground? If this isn't super mobile, is it getting as deep as I need it to? And am I getting an even distribution? So I'm encouraging an even distribution of root growth. So a big issue with potassium is the salt effect and seed safety, right? So potash, potassium chloride, has a high salt index. Among common fertilizers, potassium chloride has one of the highest salt index per unit of nutrient out of everything. So if you put too much potash on too close to the seed or young roots, it can burn them. Basically, the high osmotic concentration draws water out of the seed or root, and the chloride ion can be somewhat toxic at high concentration, right? It's not, in normal amounts, it's good, right? Chloride isn't a bad thing, but in too much, it can become toxic and really hurt production and growth. So that's why, we typically do not put significant potash in furrow with seeds. Even in a 2x2 band, if you apply a heavy rate of potash, you need to be cautious. Roots might avoid that band initially due to that salt index, right? And if I've seen, situations even recently where over time, a lot of application of potash in a dry format or in a liquid format that was not a low salt format caused salt levels to get so high in the soil that there was tons of phosphorus, potash in the ground. This was in Kansas. There's tons of it, but the crop just wasn't performing well because the roots just were super unhealthy and didn't want to expand because of the amount of salt in the soil. And so that is one thing to consider. The other thing to consider with, phosphorus, right? Phosphorus, when you look at when the plant needs these things, right? Nitrogen kind of has, a steady curve to it. Phosphorus is kind of more of the front end and potassium is more of the back end, right? Potassium is more of structural compound. Phosphorus is kind of the blood, right? It's making up the actual chlorophyll of the blood of the plant is one of the main components, whereas potassium is a very structurally heavy compound. I call it the library, and it's kind of putting all the building blocks in the right places. And so when you get to pod fill, your potassium at R1 in a soybean or, during grain fill in wheat in springtime, that's when it's going to be its highest and it's going to need the most. So the biggest impact people see on yield is they go, hey, I got the potassium in the ground. Why didn't I get a better production this year? Maybe it's just because it dried out late in the year. Well, it's not the lack of moisture necessarily. It's the lack of the ability for the plant to absorb that potassium it needs later in the year. So seeing more and more farmers using a late season potassium application as a foliar feed to address that potassium demand during dry years. So once again, that's understanding the tools that you got and applying it at the right time based on the year. Being able to adjust and say, hey, it's dried out. I'm not going to sit here and go, oh man, the rain's just not coming. It's over for me. I'm just going to lose 10, 20 bushel of yield because of the lack of rain. It's no, you can manipulate. You can manipulate that process because of the tools you have in your toolbox that you're not even using, right? And one of those tools is applying nutrients to the plant at different times and in different methods to give it that nutrient that it needs if it can't get it through the soil. And that's one of those situations where, whether it's dry form of potassium, whether it's liquid form of potassium, both are great. Both have times when they work much better than the other. One of those is always going to rely heavily on soil, and the other, is less so we can use it in different times for specific applications. So, I'm going to kind of jump through. I know we're kind of approaching our end here. So I want to kind of jump through some of the dry versus liquid consideration. And one day we'll have to come back to sulfur because that's a really good one to talk about too. And really get into micronutrients and their impact. That's its own whole segment. Your secondary nutrients, which are magnesium, calcium. Calcium really, my opinion, isn't a secondary nutrient. Everything's kind of built off of it. But, to kind of wrap up some of this conversation, and hopefully it didn't get a little too monotonous or into the weeds with explaining these forms. But it's all been to drive home this point, right? Dry isn't better than liquid. Liquid isn't better than dry. You got to understand what it takes to convert this food source into actual food to a plant, into a usable state, right? And so the best way to then, once you understand that, you can apply that to your operation with regard to ROI. So I kind of want to talk about, just real quick before we jump into a Q&A, talk a little bit about how to understand the ROI consideration when you're figuring out what to apply based on the year, based on the crop, based on the soil you're working with, right? Because one thing I see a lot of big farms do is they apply the same thing on everything, right? And they got 40 different soil types. And they're like, well, these fields perform great. These fields don't perform as great. And it's like, well, yeah, because the method you're using works great in that soil type and not great in that soil type, right? And so, it makes for an easier application, and that might make sense on an overall ROI basis for the farm, but you're losing potential ROI on certain parts of the farm because you're not taking into consideration the soil that you're working with, and either spreading out, application of nutrients on a sandier type soil or on an area that doesn't get as much rainfall, using a liquid form to foliar feed it, or in cold soils, using a liquid form to get it straight into the plant or into the root zone when there's less microbial activity to convert those things, right? And so to kind of jump, straight into the ROI comparison of how I would take these tools, and an hour is not nearly enough for this conversation. That's what I've learned today, because my notes, I made it through probably about 10% of them. And so there's a lot to go at. But what you want to look at, if you really want to understand ROI, is you have to overlay cost of the nutrient and efficiency of the nutrient based off of these factors at play, right? Soil type, soil temp, microbial population, time of year, crop, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we're saying, hey, I'm, looking at 740 pounds for DAP right now, and I get a 20% efficiency out of it, right? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to say, if you have $740 for 1 ton, right? And that 1 ton of phosphorus, in this case, we're going to specifically stick to DAP, right? So in the DAP scenario, we're talking about 46%. So we're going to take 2,000 pounds times 46%, 0.46, right? That gives us 920 actual pounds of phosphorus. And then what we'll say is, okay, now I'm going to take that 920 and I'm going to figure out what is my cost per unit. Okay, now I'm going to figure out what my cost per unit is. So you say, okay, That's $760, kind of the national average right now, right? So 760 divided by 920. And now we've got about 82.6 cents per unit. Now, that's usually where we stop, right? We go, okay, that's my cost per unit, right? But that's your cost per unit that you bought, not the cost per unit that the plant necessarily consumes. So if you say, okay, this is going to have, based off of, all the research that I'm looking at that's out there, let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Let's say instead of 20%, it's going to have 30% efficiency, right? So in other words, it's going to, we're going to have to multiply that, times 3.3, right? To get the actual cost of usable times 3.3, right? And that now we're at $2.73 for the usable amount of phosphorus, right? So now I can take that, plug that into my ROI equation to compare it to something like a liquid form of phosphate. So let's say, liquid form of phosphate, let's use something like 10, 20, 10, and let's say it's $6 a gallon, right? So $6.75, right? And so $6.75 a gallon, we know that gallon weighs about 11 pounds times 10, 20, 10. So it'd be 20% times 0.2. So we're getting about 2.2 pounds, right, of actual phosphorus. Mind you, here we're just calculating the phosphorus. So the potassium, the nitrogen there, we're just going to pretend they're not there for now. And so at 2.2, right, pounds of actual phosphorus. Now here's what we're going to do. We're say, okay, there's two ways to calculate this. We say that has 4.5 times the efficiency. So we can just take that and say multiply times 4.5 to give us the equivalent to dry, which is 9.9 pounds equivalent to dry, right? And that's where you start to hear that equivalence. And then we're going to take that, divide that by our 6.75 a gallon or whatever it is, that where you're getting it from. Now you're at $1.46 of usable nutrient. Now, that is how you determine the ROI impact of the nutrient you're using, right? You've got to understand how much of this nutrient am I going to get in this form this year based off of the soil I'm working with, based off of the weather factor, based off of all these other things at play that are impacting the actual use, right? The actual uptake, the actual ROI, because you didn't come here and listen to me ramble for the past hour about nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, because you just, maybe you did, but most of us probably aren't here because you just love chemistry, right? You're here because it's like, how do I apply these things to make more money out of my business, out of my farm, right? And that is how we start to derive those things. Same goes for nitrogen, right? If urea is significantly cheaper per unit, and we're going to get a high efficiency because we're applying it during a wetter time of year, we're getting more rainfall, then it's going to be a more efficient and more effective ROI factor, being a cheaper form of input early season, especially on things like hay or pre-plant. Then I'm going to compare that cost per unit to UAN and in let's say 32% form and go, okay, what's the efficiency factor of this and the cost per unit, and do that same math, and you can get down to the actual usable nutrient cost. And then the next phase, and what we'll address in later weeks, is now what is the impact on ROI food pyramid, right? A lot of times we think, for things like corn, wheat, hay, it's nitrogen's at the top. Yes, it is, but it's not sitting there by itself. Okay. Once again, it's no different than the gas in your car, right? Just because you've got the gas doesn't mean you're going to go as far if you don't have the right things to support it. And that's where, we start to look at the ROI impact of things like micronutrients. And we'll get into that in the future. Of boron is a catalyst in the plant, meaning it makes cell division, cell elongation more efficient. It's using less energy. So that unit of nitrogen is going further, right? So if I'm going, okay, obviously I know I need the nitrogen, right? But I have this consideration. I'm low on boron. It would take $10 boron per acre to get it back to where my optimal is based off of my desired yield and nitrogen input. Or I could use an extra X amount of nitrogen to just bypass the need for that, increase the efficiency. More often than not, what you'll find is that additional nitrogen is now an additional $20 or $30 of input to equate for the lack of efficiency, right? The lack of miles per gallon that we're getting is now costing us more than just increasing the MPG. And so those are the ways that, you take the liquid versus dry conversation, you nullify the whole argument of which one's better or worse, and you understand the science behind it. And then once you get an idea of the science, you apply that to be able to make more money as a business owner and as a farmer, because that is at the end of the day why we're here, right? We are here because we need to find ways to drive down input cost, drive up our margin, and do better as a community in understanding what really impacts my pocketbook at the end of the year. And so with that all being said, looks like we've got a few people in the chat over here. I had it closed the whole time. Now's the time, if you got some questions, throw them in the chat. I'd be happy to start answering. I see one in here that already got answered, but yes, this is being recorded, so we'll publish this. So if you didn't catch some of it, came in late, whatever it may be, you got a buddy that you're like, man, so-and-so needs to hear this. We will publish this in the following days so that it's more accessible after the fact. And then I'm happy to, if it's something that people want, we can send out a little poll or survey and just write in. If you want the more in-depth kind of written notes or presentation or whatever science, man, just let us know. I'm happy to share. So if anybody has any questions, throw them in the chat. I'm going to kind of hop while I'm waiting to see if we get any into kind of a couple common questions that I get quite a bit, and address those first, and then we can kind of come back around to the chat as people jump in there, and we'll we can answer any question that might be out there before we wrap up. And sometimes, at least for me, it's typically like I know I want to ask questions, but it's as soon as I hang up the phone with somebody or walk out of the room, I'm like, oh, dang, I should have asked this. I should have asked that, right? So if that happens, once again, just reach out to us. That's one of the things that, AgriTec and a lot of people here really, we enjoy this, man. We love farming. We love the farming community. Most everybody here in some aspect is farming themselves. And so sharing information to make each other stronger is what we're all about. And it doesn't come with a focus on, hey, buy this, it comes with a focus on, hey, I just want to help. I'll help you find somewhere else to get it that's cheaper if we don't have it, So one of the common questions I get is liquid fertilizer. Is it just watered down fertilizer, or are you just paying for the water? And the answer to that is no, right? There was a time period where that might have been more so the case, but now a liquid fertilizer is typically, like we've talked about, going to be a different form of nutrient that is in suspension, rather than just a liquefied form of MAP or DAP or nitrogen, urea, sorry. And so that it is where you want to understand the forms that you're getting your nitrogen in. So another question again is, do you need dry fertilizer to build soil levels, or can you use only liquids? And if you use only liquids, are you mining the soil? And so this is an interesting topic, because what now you're really asking is, am I getting enough nutrient to supplement the plant's need, right? Out of my liquid application compared to my dry. And really, the same thing can go for the dry. If you're not getting enough dry fertilizer on, you could be mining the soil as well. And soil mining is something we'll want to talk about, because there's a lot of lack of understanding of what the nutrients on your soil test are actually representing. When you look at a soil test, that's not the total amount of nutrients in the ground, by the way. At least not your cations in particular, or even, your phosphorus specifically, your potassium specifically. A lot of the vast majority of your nutrients are part of soil structure. What you're seeing on the soil test is your elemental nutrients, those nutrients that are in an absorbable state or bound to soil colloid in a way that the plant can actually eat it, right? It'd be no different than if, you took, let's just say, a cow carcass, threw it out there. It's made up of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, but a plant's not going to immediately be able to eat that cow, right? The soil is the same way. Your soil is made up of all of these elements, right? It has tons of potassium and phosphorus that are part of its structure. And so understanding how to use those, how to get those into a usable state for the plant helps decrease those input costs. That's really the conversation that we should have is, hey, how do you use more of what you got instead of paying to put more on? That's really what we should, I think, would talk about next week, or not next week, but next webinar, whenever that is in the next couple of weeks, is, hey, right now, this market is not great and cost of my inputs are horrible. So how do I use more of what I got? Because you might not know this, you've got a bunch of unusable, right now unusable, right? Not in general, unusable material. And it's no different than I've got an oil well in my backyard or oil just coming up out of the ground, but I can't put that in my car, so I still got to go to the gas station, buy it. Right? But if there's ways that you can easily convert that into usable fuel, right? Now it doesn't make any sense to go to the gas station so much. You've got it all right there. And so that's one of those things that, we want to get a little more into is building soil reserves, both through synthetic implementation or application, or through soil health management to increase soil mineralization rate. How do you increase salt in the soil? So that is a very good question and a very interesting question, because it's more often than not, people are trying to decrease salt in the soil. And but once again, multiple forms of nutrients can be really salt heavy or real light on salt, like we talked about with potassium. And so to answer, your question, Pat, salt is an interesting topic because sodium as your primary, salt is an energy source, right? It's one of those catalysts that we should talk about in the future. So high salt fertilizers are going to naturally increase it because of the chloride in there. So, chloride-based fertilizers like potash, one of the highest salt inputs that you can get while also getting something else that's really good. Ammonium-based nitrogen sources like ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate, UAN will contribute salt load. One thing, though, that you want to be cautious of is, are you getting the right salt? So here's what I mean by that is salt isn't always sodium. It can be sodium, it can be chloride, it can be sulfates, right? And so, you can be getting salt from water, rain, not as much rainwater used to, a lot more sulfates came from the rainwater than they do now. And so what you want to know is what salt is it you're trying to increase, and are you increasing them in correct distribution? And sometimes you're getting salt out of things that you're using, but you didn't even realize that was in there, like potash, potassium chloride having salt in it. But if you're specifically talking about sodium, that's one of those where it's a fine line, right? There's a lot of those micronutrients where there's a fine line between it's really helping me and now it's hurting me. And so, what I would say is you want to understand what salt am I talking about and make sure that things like sulfur, you're getting the right amount out there. That can have such a huge impact. I wish we had more time to talk about sulfur today. It has such a huge impact because sulfur is a key component of the protein molecule, right? So if I'm trying to grow protein, whether that be corn, hay, wheat, soybeans, you name it, peanuts. If I'm trying to grow protein and I don't have one of the key elements that makes protein, it's probably going to be a lot harder to grow protein, right? And so with that being said, a lot of times too, manure will have pretty good salt levels in it. Poultry litter has a moderate salt load to it. So, and then, decreasing leaching will help you hold any nutrient much more effectively in the soil. How do I lower magnesium levels in the soil? That's a great question. I really like that question. Here's why. Back to my cup analogy, right? The hardest thing and really the most impossible thing is taking something out of the ground, right? We don't have any technology yet to just go in and plug it out. So what is it we want to look at with regard to magnesium? Magnesium is a big one because you get too much magnesium, you get what we call magnesium poisoning. It makes soil really heavy, really sticky. You get poor root development. You get poor nutrient mobility. You get poor water penetration. You get a lot of water pulling on top. If you've ever walked across the field and had like 10 pounds of mud stuck to your boots, that's potassium, or sorry, magnesium buildup in the soil. So what you really want to look at is the base saturation of that magnesium, right? So if you have a really high magnesium base saturation, or even parts per million, a really high amount of your cation exchange sites are made up of that, you need a different nutrient to displace that magnesium off of that receptor site in that cup, right? In that cation exchange capacity cup, to decrease the percentage of the soil that's made up of that magnesium on the receptor sites and increase the level of something else. That other thing, the easiest thing to do it with is going to be calcium. So there's two ways to do it. Gypsum is effective because a lot of times magnesium results in really high pH. So the sulfur in the gypsum helps to lower pH, and then the calcium in the gypsum helps to displace that magnesium. Or liquid forms of calcium or even liming can help to increase calcium base saturation, which will naturally shove magnesium off those receptor sites, decreasing that down to the more respectable range and where it needs to be. A little off from current conversation today, but I have higher calcium numbers in my soils, high 70s and into mid 80s, but have a lower pH of 5.9 to 6.1. Magnesium is average at 6%. So you need to get magnesium in the soil, right? Does that need brought up to work with lime? Okay, so that's a great question. And nothing's off topic. We're here to talk, man. This is great. I'm loving it. And hey, if you got a question about something other than what we talked about, hey, let's go. I got nothing better to do right now than this right here. So, okay, so let's talk about the opposite side, right? We talked about getting magnesium out. Now let's talk about getting magnesium in. So pH reflects, it stands for percent hydrogen, right? Hydrogen, right? Empty space. So what pH is measuring more often than not, obviously, is acidity, but it's hydrogen concentration within the cation exchange capacity complex, which is that empty space. So it's saying, hey, you're missing something. But right now you're saying, hey, 70, 80% of my soil, this little label's in the way, but 70, 80% of my soil is made up of calcium. I'm good, man. Calcium, we want calcium to be, around 75%, but my pH is low. Well, that's because you have hydrogen in the ground because you don't have the magnesium. So what you need to do is get with Jason. Jason's got too much mag. You got too little. You guys can work. No, I'm just kidding. So using magnesium-based compounds to increase that magnesium in the soil can help to increase that magnesium base saturation target. So here's your targets, right? For base saturation, 65 to 75% calcium is standard, right? For legumes, at least 75%. They like a lot of calcium. For magnesium, you want it around 15%, right? Potassium, about 3 to 5. That leaves you with about 10% or less empty space in the soil. That equates to a 6.8 pH more often than not. That I say more often than not because you have other things like aluminum at play in the soil. So what you can do to correct magnesium is you can use things like dolomitic lime, right? So dolomitic lime is applying magnesium instead of calcium in the lime format. That'll help you raise that pH by putting the right nutrient in the ground, because we don't want to just keep putting calcium on. That's not going to help anything. We want to get that magnesium up. And so you want to use dolomitic lime to do that, okay? That's going to have the best impact on that soil structure for you. I fertilized on Good Friday and used urea, 200 pounds to acre, with 92 pounds of that being nitrogen, okay? On coastal inclined grass, and received 1.5 inches of rain in 5 days, but then went with no rain until 2 days ago. The fields were dry and burning up, but now we have gotten 3.8 inches of rain on Monday. Is a fertilizer going to be utilized and be able to cut for hay? That's actually a really good question. And what you have working towards your favor there is that first rain, right? You applied before rain. That was huge, right? Because as we talked about, if that granule just sits on the soil, it's going to start turning into gas. You're going to start losing it. So the initial rain helped a bunch. The drought, it's stalling growth, right? Because you can't absorb the nitrogen, you can't absorb the potassium, the phosphorus that you need without the moisture to carry it into the plant. So meanwhile, there was some mineralization of N, which has started to convert it to nitrate. which means you've lost a little bit of, right? But the recent 3.8 inches of rain is your lifeline. If the grass still has viability, right, that rain is going to jumpstart growth. The majority of that nitrogen got deposited into the soil with the first rain. So it's kind of like your bank account that was just waiting for that plant to be able to draw off of it. And so, yeah, to answer your question, yes, you are in good shape. That is not a problem. That first rain was you timed your application perfectly with getting it on before the rain. The second rain is now going to just kickstart things and get it going, right? I would, keep an eye on your green up for uniformity, because one thing that might have happened is if certain areas of the soil dried out more or had pooling with that first rain, you might get concentration of nitrogen in certain areas and lack thereof in others. Just something to keep an eye on. Let's see, I live on a shill, so soil varies in depth from 0 inches to 12 inches deep. Will this work? All I do is hay and pasture. I'm told I need to lime a lot. So, yeah, the 0 inches is going to be tough to grow grass on. that's going to be tough. But the 12 inches, man, that's, that gives you still a pretty good base. When we take a soil sample, we're typically taking it out of the first 6 inches. So 12 inches gives you quite a bit. To actually put some math to it for you, to go back to the conversation about, what your soil is made of, about 3% of soil by weight is made up of potassium, which means that 12-inch area, or even those areas that are only 6 inches deep before you start to hit rock, you're holding, do the math on this, 6 inches of soil with water removed, average CEC of 10, has a weight of about 2.2 million pounds. You'd have about 82,000 pounds of potassium in every 6 inches. So when you're 12 inches of soil, if it's good semi-loamy soil with a CEC of 10, you've got 160,000 pounds of potassium per acre in there. So yeah, you've got plenty to grow with, right? What your biggest difficulty is going to be is moisture management, because you're not having a ton of exchange of moisture up and down in the soil. So think of like a sponge. When the thicker sponge, when this top starts to dry out, moisture is going to come up, and it's gonna keep that top area moist longer, versus real thin sponge, it's going to dry out faster. So that's going to be your biggest issue that you're dealing with is is your moisture control. As far as needing to lime a lot, that is going to come down a lot to holding capacity. And then the other downside of that, it's also going to come down to mineralization. So if you're having an issue with lime mineralizing or soil structure mineralizing to release things like magnesium and calcium from soil structure, that issue is being caused because of that moisture fluctuation. When that soil gets real hot and dry, it's going to be difficult for microbial life to sustain in there, and you're losing a lot. So your biggest impact you could probably have on a soil like that is doing your best to constantly be promoting your microbial populations with like prebiotic or micronutrient application. That's going to really help mineralization, keeping those calcium, that magnesium available in the soil, and that'll help keep that pH up, decrease how much lime you're having to put out. And the nice little side effect about having good microbes, they can't fully keep you from having drought or dry soil, but a lot of their process actually has a byproduct of H2O, which means you're increasing natural soil moisture by having those in there. Good deal. All right, Brent. All right. If anybody has any other questions, we actually are out of time, so shoot us an email, text, call, whatever's easiest for you. The good thing is there's a lot of people here that are really smarter than me, and we're just we love to answer questions and help people, whether it be with common things like soil conditions, varying soil types, what to use, when to use, how to use it, or where to get it, right? Just because you call us doesn't mean we're going to try to sell you something. We'll try to help you find the best solution for whatever it is you're looking for. And one thing I will tell you is the best place to start is understanding your soil and understanding your process. And you have to start with the soil, because if you don't know the engine and the vehicle that you're driving, it's going to be a lot harder to be effective. Especially, if you're trying to use that to then go, okay, I want to grow more hay, so I'm going to put on more nitrogen. I'm going to put on 300 pounds of urea and you have a CEC of 3, a lot of your nitrogen is leaching quickly. It'd be better to spread that out. So start with understanding the medium that you're working with. That's your biggest impact. Thank you guys. For those of you who stuck around here to the end, thanks for being in here. Hopefully this wasn't, hopefully this was as beneficial as we want it to be. Brent said, email me this answer. How long to let the grass grow now before I cut today? I'll get back to you with that. We'll shoot you an email there. And Jack, I just saw you said, did you see my question? All right, I ain't gonna hang up yet. Let me find your question. Hang on, Jack. All right. My concern is when spraying fertilizer, it ends up on the plant, not in the soil. Okay, man, I'm glad we came back to that. That's a really good question. So yes, when spraying fertilizer, depending on the application method that you're using, right? The tip. If you're using a drone, right, it's gonna have real fine particles. It's not really gonna get to the soil. If you're using something like a streamer nozzle, larger droplet size, a little bit easier to get past plant tissue, get down to the soil. So if you're going, okay, I want to use, liquid, but I need to get it to the soil, timing of application based on crop height, canopy, stage of growth, or if it's grass, how tall it is, that's going to impact how quickly and easily that gets to the ground. Another thing, right, is if applying right before rain, the rain's going to help wash that in. So if you're like, I don't want it sitting on the foliage for so long, I want it in the ground, then you're going to want to time that with rain. Versus if you're like, hey, I want more foliar uptake out of this application, I'm trying to use a smaller amount but have it be super highly effective, then you're going to want like 6 to 12 hours of no rain at least after that application so that it's not immediately washing off the foliage and into the soil. So rain is one of those things that, you can use to your advantage to either get things in the ground quicker with regard to liquid application to get it past foliage, or, to not apply right before rain so that you get a little bit more time on that foliage, right? Just like herbicide, right? If you're going to spray herbicide, you probably don't want to do it right before it's going to rain. You're not going to get a lot out of it. And so, using rain to your advantage and growth and crop timing, right? Real short grass, you're going to have more exposed soil versus, 2-3 feet of growth. Corn and soybeans, if you're applying to those, pre-canopy is going to be the easiest to get it to the soil, or dropping that application between the rows so that you're banding it or side dressing it or wide dropping it on. That'll help get it down where it needs to be. So if you don't want it tied up. With that being said, we're going to wrap it up for this first run. Appreciate everybody, your patience with me and my coherent and incoherent rambling. Hopefully you learned something today, and I very much look forward to the next one. If you want to see updates on when the next one of these will be, or answer some more questions that people have, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, any of those areas. And man, we love all of our farmers. We love this community, and I really appreciate every person we work with, everything that you do for this country, for this community, and for the world to keep things going around. A lot of people don't realize what it takes and how hard it is to do this job. And so I just want to end with saying thank you. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.